examine incidents with an unbiased lens. I believe there's a lot to learn from the horrors you experienced.
There's nothing to learn. There are no new insights or discoveries.
So is he real?
Who?
The boogeyman. I read you
You
quoted.
don't believe in a boogeyman?
I believe in Michael Myers, a deranged serial killer, but
I need to report a crime.
And this was cash?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Can you describe suspect?
Big guy, must weigh 250.
We're gonna hold on to this money.
I didn't get his badge number.
There was a path that
Following account shared with me by Robert Y., a Fraser King.
Retro video games are getting way too expensive. What was once stumbling into a flea market and picking up a soggy box of various Sega Saturn games for a $5 has turned into the search for a deal that won't break the bank. Growing up, I could find copies of Earthbound laying around for 20, maybe $30. These days, nope, not even close. The market for retro games has eclipsed the point of no return for casual play, and if you're wanting to play, say, any classic Pokemon title, you've got three options. Pay up, pull out a loan and pay up, or click a few mystery links and get it running on emulation, which I'm obviously doing because there's no dimension where I'm throwing down this much for a copy of Persona 2. Nearly $1,000 for a boxed copy of Mega Man X3? I think I'll pick up the HD collection and not spend, a month's rent. But it ain't just the good and popular games. As we all know, any one of these can appreciate and blow up in value for whatever reason. And as y'all are aware, some of them are bizarre. $150 for the educational dentist simulator Rex Ronan Experimental Surgeon? Surely this information is still relevant.
If you're sick and need medicine, take medicine that is yours.
So yo, it's Austin, and today, once again, we're going to be diving into the relentless and ever-growing world of expensive and rare video games. Not paying for all of them, of course. I don't think there's many jobs out there where you can justify buying a boxed copy of Pocky and Rocky 2. At that point, you're just being silly. Although, I guess I am dumb enough to buy one of these on a whim. It's a problem. We've got a lot we need to get into today, but before we get started, I need to talk about today's sponsor and something I've actually used for a while now, Soylent. You've seen the memes, you've probably heard or made the joke, hey, isn't that people? But no, this is Soylent. Soylent is a complete nutrition brand with a science-based take on health and wellness. It's fully plant-based, packing 20 grams of protein, and has been dubbed the world's most perfect food. That ain't just me, that's science. A while ago, I used to be a lot bigger. During my personal weight loss journey, Soylent was a pretty decent part of that. Back then, it was just a powder, but nowadays there's the whole peanut gallery of options and flavors, including some with caffeine. I usually like to grab a variety pack so I can try a different flavor every now and then, but recently I've been enjoying the mint chocolate flavor, which is technically Soylent Green, but yeah, plants. Soylent's a good way to get just the right amount of nutrients at an affordable price without any cleanup. That's average $2 to $4 a serving, which, if you look around, is pretty hard to beat right now. So Soylent's teamed up with us to get y'all a special deal. If you click the link down in the description or use the code, you'll be able to save a decent amount off your first box today. Click the link down in the description, and thanks to Soylent for the sponsor. Now, let's talk about some video games, rare ones to be specific. But what makes a game valuable besides, supply and demand, obviously? I don't know. I don't think any of these had the intent of rolling into the new century and costing somebody an arm and a leg. And some of them only become rarities when a brand new game in the series gets announced, which is exactly what happened with Armored Core. I loved this game as a kid. It's hard to say no to anything that allows you to pilot a giant mech, especially when it gave you a mix of strategy and customization to tackle. From Software's long-running franchise is one that I played every other entry of growing up. And despite its now aged clunkiness, it's still a great time. The premise was simple. The Great Destruction wiped out a majority of humanity. People became survivors, and then slowly corporations sponsored mercenaries, specifically Ravens, doing anything for the right price. You unlock and buy parts to upgrade your AC, you tackle missions to get money, and slowly make your way up the best pilot charts. The original Armored Core absolutely feels and looks dated in the 2020s, but it also holds up in a way that only a classic PlayStation 1 game can. It just also decided to balloon in price dramatically over the last 2 years. Prior to the pandemic, you could find a copy of this one sitting around for like 20 bucks, no problem, for years. Then, the second the extremely good Fires of Rubicon got announced, boom, we're in the triple digits. Now, take what I just said and do it for almost every game in the entire series. If you're interested in a boxed copy of 90% of these, you'll be shelling out a stupid amount. The PlayStation 1 titles definitely have it worst, although it seems like anyone craving some fast-paced mecha action is gonna just pick up 6. And I don't blame ya, it's extremely good. Now, for the price of nearly 3 Armored Cores, you could also snatch you a box physical of Klonoa Door to Phantomile. Doesn't this have a remake? Yup, 2 of them. It's even got a sequel on the PlayStation 2. However, none of those remakes or ports have ever come close to really feeling like the PlayStation 1 original. Prior to fusing with Bandai, Namco really wanted a piece of that 90s mascot pie after Pac-Man was losing its grip, and Klonoa was, in my opinion, a fantastic attempt. Klonoa uses a mix of 2.5D platforming that's rendered in a multi-directional 3D setting. You've also only got 2 buttons to use here, jump and your ring. You can use that to grab onto dudes, use them as a jumping platform, or throw them into other objects. It's incredibly simple to the point where you might wonder, well, where's the beef? It's just that the meat is in the overall vibe. The levels gradually get more difficult, but not too much. There's collectibles in each stage and Phantomillions to rescue. Truthfully, it's not very long at all. You can have everything done in about 5 hours or so, which is dreadfully short for the modern price. It's like, what, $60 an hour? Sure. Door to Phantomile actually has a decent story with a presentation that may be outdated, but it works. All of the characters are technically voiced, none of which comes out in a decipherable language, and despite being clearly targeted for the kiddos, it's held up. Bit of a tearjerker of an ending too. I love the way that the 3D models look. Look at Gattius here. This is a JRPG villain if I've ever seen one. Despite reviewing well, unfortunately, it wasn't too hot on the sales charts here in the States. I think that's likely because the North American PlayStation audience was already deep in the wacky extreme 90s. I do think that this would have had a totally different reputation if it had released on the Nintendo 64 back in the day. At the very least, it's and the wildly expensive spin-offs, oh my god, are now considered cult hits, even some of the best platformers from the era. The remake is still a decent experience, but I've always thought that it was an uncanny reflection of the original. The only way to play this one legit without yoinking it off the internet is to pull out the old PS3 and pick up the PS1 Classic before that inevitably gets taken down. Though, maybe you should. Klonoa is great. Kicking it back in time a bit, let's head on over to the Sega CD. Now here's a console filled with some rarities. The Sega/Mega CD may not have been a huge hit in the West, but it did manage to put out a few bangers, some of which have stood the test of time. Your Lunar 1 and 2s, Wolfchild, and anyone who's playing Robo LS knows they're playing greatness. Then you've got something that's been a rare, sought after, and pricey as far back as I can remember. Around the same time as the birth of Metal Gear, we'd also see Hideo Kojima's Snatcher. The original Japanese PC release of this may be from the 80s, but the only time it actually came stateside was in 1995 on the Sega CD, and never again. Which is a shame, because Snatcher was absolutely a cult classic. Visual novel point-and-click adventure games have never really been on the forefront of the mainstream. Despite their quality, your Monkey Islands, Grim Fandangos, Broken Swords, and King's Quests were never the type of game to sell multi-million copies. That is, unless your name was missed, which was a huge deal. Over in Japan, the visual novel genre was, and still is, popping off, but even so, something like Snatcher failed to become commercially successful. successful. That's crazy to me because Snatcher is a standout. You could tell Kojima was on an 80s sci-fi kick with this one, as environments and the world pull a lot from Blade Runner, Akira, and other cyberpunk media like Bubblegum Crisis. There's not much to talk about beyond the narrative, considering it's, well, literally the entire experience, but Snatcher's heavy M rating and colorful cast of characters are something that demand a revisit. And they did, with a Japanese-only PlayStation 1 and Saturn port the next year. Not for me, I guess. The only way to experience this legit in the West is through a Sega CD copy, which is not only censored in multiple ways, but will also run you an easy breezy $900 for a complete copy. Yeah, okay, don't forget to pick up one of them Konami Justifiers for another $50 for the shooting sections, and you're nearly 4 figures in the hole for a visual novel. I mean, it is cool, but yeah, I love the 90s voice acting though.
Get out! And I thought you were such a gentleman.
Welcome to Outer Heaven. Table for one?
Is that a flippin' Metal Gear reference? Speaking of consoles that are notoriously expensive, how about the Sega Saturn? Yeah, there's like a ridiculous amount of games that are in triple-digit territory. Last time we went a little into Magic Knight Re-Earth, which is such a banger to me, but today we've got one of the best things on the console, Burning Rangers. It's definitely an acquired taste. Burning Rangers is a bonkers concept tossed together into a fast-paced arcade setting where you play as the most late 90s thing possible. By that, I mean a futuristic group of super anime firefighters known as the Burning Rangers. There's a decent amount of characters to unlock, but you start controlling one of two, Sho Amabane or Tillis. Since this is a bit more arcadey, it doesn't drastically change anything, but there is different dialogue depending on who you pick. You just gotta be ready for some classic video game voice acting.
This is great! Chris, it's okay if I ride on his back for a while, right? Please?
Okay, but only if I can get to ride first.
Burning Rangers was one of those non-Sonic Sonic Team releases, most of which could go either way with the quality. It had an all-star group of developers on it, including pre-punished Yuji Naka and amazing character designs by Naoto Oshima, the Balance Squad. The music here is definitely the shining star. Whenever it fully kicks in, the vibes are immaculate. That is, when you're not having an argument with the controls. I don't think Burning Rangers feels terrible, but it certainly isn't as good as you would hope. The Saturn controller, even the 3D one, doesn't help too much with the tight corridor design of the levels. Plus, navigation's done mostly with in-game audio cues from your captain, which is honestly a neat mechanic. They just might lead you astray from time to time. I will say that this thing pushes the Sega Saturn to the very edge of its limitations. I feel like the console's gonna have a meltdown and explode. You might need to call the Burning Rangers. You can feel and see the game loading in all the geometry as you're playing it. It's just not enough to really detract from how much fun it is in execution. Burning Rangers is designed to be played a lot as it'll track your stats and has that classic Sega design of trial and error speed runs. The fire will explode from the walls with backdrafts trying to impede your progress, and you're even given a rank at the end of a mission. I just think that maybe 4 levels in total is a bit too short. You can nail this thing out in 2 to 3 hours in your first go, and in 1998 that was excessively quick. Nowadays, if you want to pick up a physical box copy, it'll run you well over $600, which, unless you're really into it, just isn't worth the price of entry. At least it emulates well. Burning Rangers is an amazing idea that has yet to be revisited, and that's a little depressing. It gave us a glimpse into this fascinating world, a killer soundtrack, a silly concept that they went 100% in on, and a cast of fun characters. I'm just glad the others are unlockable. The second I saw someone named Big Landman, I knew that was my guy. Whatever Sega's doing with their new Sega Ages Super Game or whatever, they need to bring this one back. No buts. I don't want to hear them.
Nice work, guys.
In my opinion, those are classic. Games that may not be super obscure, but definitely left a mark when they came out. None of them really have the popularity of like Pokemon, but they're all still very much worth playing by any means. Which brings me to my next section, one that I have named simply, I have literally never heard of this. I think that gets the point across. It's time to whip out the 3DO.
The most advanced home gaming system in the universe. It's time to put away your toys.
Ah, the 3DO. I never knew you? The fourth and fifth generations of video game consoles had several releases that went entirely under the radar. Also, consoles clearly, as the 3DO really hasn't had a long-lasting impact. You can file it right next to the CDI. Decent tech for the time, but the games didn't quite hit the finish line. Regardless, around 250 games released on this bad boy, and with that relative obscurity, you can bet a whole bunch of exclusive, weird ideas can only be found for a hefty price. The holy grail, of course, being a boxed copy of Dino Park Tycoon, a port of a mech DOS sim. Just a worse version of it in every way, since you control the mouse with a controller. It's fine. What I really want to bring up is Lucien's Quest, a Japanese RPG. No, this isn't a joke. From the looks of it, the 3DO had a mild presence overseas, with several Japanese exclusives hitting the platform. Whip out that copy of Pretty Soldier Sailor Moon S and pull off combos with one of these. Lucien's Quest, also known as Sword and Sorcery over in Japan, is a classic RPG with a generic story. You take control of Lucien as she embarks on a quest after being stuck in her master's tower. You get a party, you do mage stuff, and try to help people and eventually the world, probably. It's got this interesting battle system where attacks are done in lines, and you can hide behind others to not take damage. You can interact with the environment for shielding as well as throwing things too. Though looking through the footage, you can see the main issue. Lucien's Quest runs like ass. It's rocking a solid 10 to 15 frames a second the entire time, and like Burning Rangers, you can see the entire world falling apart on the edges of the screen. There's a neat feature where you can have alternate camera angles, but the stretchy scaling pixels meshed onto these tilted 3D backgrounds is more confusing than anything else. I think Lucien's Quest fails from a technical standpoint 100%. The Japanese-only Sega Saturn version does run a bit better. It actually shows character portraits and dialogue, the combat sprites are more detailed, and it's overall the better product. Even so, it can't quite escape the frame rate dimension. Grabbing one of these on Panasonic's console box is going to run you a pricey $600, 400 loose for one heck of a svelte box art. Just remember, anytime during your quest that you're exploring an amazingly realistic world. Keeping it with swords and sorcery, have you ever played Incantation? If not, I don't blame you. It was a late Super Nintendo title developed by Titus France that put you in control of a little wizard guy, this little blonde kid, or a brunette in game. On the box, he looks totally different too, but all three iterations of him look like they'd say terrible things to you on Xbox Live.
But yeah, you're gay.
Incantation didn't review well at all, which kind of makes sense considering the developer would go on to create Superman 64. Woo-hoo. This isn't that bad though. It's actually got a little in common with Gunstar Heroes of all things. You've got little spells that you can sling about that'll change depending on your pickups, some objectively worse than others. Unfortunately, you can't avoid them, so if you touch them, your precious spell will disappear in an instant. It's a real cute concept that starts off promising, but it quickly becomes evident that they didn't know what to do with the level design. It's a classic case of get every item to exit the level, but that'll reset anytime you die, which is very easy to do. The stages are also open-ended, so you might spend a lot of time looking for this small feather icon, only to fall into a pit and have to restart and collect all three again. It seems like it would be a good time from a distance, but no, not really. More frustrating than anything. Anyways, if you want a copy of Incantation, a game I'd never heard of until this week, you'd better be prepared to throw down $200 just for a cartridge alone. Nothing like spending half a grand on a stinker. You can also do that with Moon Ranger for the original NES. Oh, it's been a hot minute since I've experienced platforming this bad. I guess that makes sense though, considering this was one of those unlicensed games for the console. Yeah, back when the Nintendo seal of quality meant the bare minimum. Odyssey Software's Moon Ranger manages to encapsulate pain in cartridge form. You play as this schmuck as you alternate between two gameplay styles, space shooting and platforming, both of which feel like the worst of their respective genres. Now, this was one of those unlicensed games for the console. Yeah, back when the Nintendo seal of quality meant the bare minimum. Odyssey Software's Moon Ranger manages to encapsulate pain in cartridge form. You play as this schmuck as you alternate between two gameplay styles, space shooting and platforming, both of which feel like the worst of their respective genres. Not much to see here, just an ugly baby blue cart and a $500 price tag. You know what? We can spend more. Aero Fighters for the Super Nintendo, a console port of an arcade classic, probably the most expensive thing on the platform. Get out that checkbook, because we're spending over 3,000 in box today. Aero Fighters, also known overseas as Sonic Wings, is actually a good game though. This one's the first of several games to hit multiple platforms, mostly on your Neo Geos. It's got a thumping Super Nintendo soundtrack, solid controls, and the exact amount of length and stage variety that you'd want in one of these. Unfortunately, it got, at least in my opinion, unfairly ripped apart by reviews that didn't really get classic shmups. That and the original had a longer vertical screen, while this was crammed into a more traditional box. A lot of people behind games like this left to form Psycho, which ruled the shoot-'em-up genre for an entire decade. I think the original Super Nintendo version is totally worth playing, just not for $3,000.
I don't want to be around anymore.
The only other game I would have for I have never heard of this would be physical copies of The Last Guy. It's Japanese only. The game is new enough and just kind of okay, but those things are going for $200 to $300, which is crazy. For now, I want to move into the realm of familiar IPs, cartoons, movies, you know it. Typically, your licensed stuff is only inches away from the bargain bin, but ever so often a game will come out that has a low print run or something and becomes rare because of that. For example, Jungle Book Rhythm and Groove. Jungle Book Rhythm and Groove Dance Bundle. Yeah, that little ugly DDR pad ripoff and box cost this game to shoot up from less than $10 to a full $250 plus. It's not even a cool looking pad. The box is only showing me stock drawings of it. They must have put no effort into it. Just children staring directly up at you, knowing they asked for Dance Dance Revolution and you got them this instead. I'm not really sure who this game is for, so let's talk about the Flintstones Surprise at Dinosaur Peak. You know who made good games? Taito. They may not be as prevalent these days, but in the 80s they were slinging out arcade classics and random cult hits left and right. Am I just a sucker for Lufia too? Absolutely. But also, Flintstones Surprise at Dinosaur Peak is a decent time. It certainly beats the Master System, Fred must paint the wall. You take control of both Fred and Barney, who actually have different movesets. Barney can move across ropes, while Fred can climb up ledges, a rarity of the NES days, although this did come out all the way in 1993, which kind of explains a lot. We've got a bunch of stage variety. There's surfing levels, mine carts, and whatever this is. It's not the best platformer out there, although it certainly has a lot of charm. And also, NES difficulty. This one's actually a sequel to an older title, The Rescue of Dino and Hoppy, which by itself goes for a decent amount. Now, Surprise at Dinosaur Peak? A loose cart will run you nearly $1,400 with a complete in-box swinging for the fences at over $3,000. Or, and check this out, a whopping 170 kilobytes. You know what deserves a better reputation? Duck Dodgers starring Daffy Duck. Sorry.
Duck Dodgers in the 24th and a half century.
This original Looney Tunes short that was a parody of the period popular Buck Rogers in the 25th century somehow ended up spawning a random Nintendo 64 video game nearly 50 years later. This was before the standalone cartoon too. Well, Paradigm Entertainment teamed up with Infogrames to bring us, in my opinion, a bit of a hidden gem. Certain magazines crushed this one when it released in 2000, and I think it's a lot better than that. You just gotta deal with a bit of wonky 5th generation camera. You control, obviously, Duck Dodgers as you play through multiple stages across different planets, searching for Marvin the Martian. Despite having older visuals on the crunchy old Nintendo 64, I feel like they were able to recreate that Looney Tunes feeling with aesthetics and level design. You want Acme? Oh, you'll get Acme. Pure, out-of-control, wildly destructive Acme. It's little touches like this that make it stand out. Duck Dodgers is a clear step behind some of the best 3D platformers on the Nintendo 64, but it's also a lot better than I think it gets credit for. It just also happens to be more expensive than all of them too, with box copies going for $290. It's rare that a licensed game will reach those prices, but leave it to the Nintendo 64 to make it happen. In other instances, a release will be identical on multiple platforms and be absurdly more pricey on another. For example, Samurai Jack Shadow of Aku. A more normal $30 to $50 on the PlayStation 2 and a crazy $140 on the GameCube. Weirdly published by Sega, they teamed up with Cartoon Network to put out a game on the popular show from the time. One that didn't review well. Shadow of a Coup really wanted to resemble the highly stylish show, but failed to deliver. The moment-to-moment gameplay lacks the oomph that you would expect, and even the slow-motion Sakai mode just ends up being a filter on the screen as opposed to anything cool. At this point, multiple Devil May Cries have made an impact in action games, and this decided to go a more simplistic button-mashy route. One that doesn't feel great either. That and a lot of the worlds just kind of look the same the entire way through. With something as stylish as Samurai Jack, you definitely wanted to put a little more effort into that. I don't know how the Game Boy Advance title replicated the style more accurately, but it is what it is. It looks like the more recent Samurai Jack title got middle-of-the-road review scores too. I think these should have been a shoo-in.
Are you here to save our friends?
What has happened to your friends?
A coup forces them to play video games that rot their brains into mush.
Video games?
One last licensed game today, and it's one that I actually own because I'm kind of a freak. You're not escaping the Marvel superheroes today. X-Men Children of the Atom.
Would you hear that? What was it, babies? What was it? No, I heard it too. I don't know what it was.
I love X-Men. That should be obvious at this point. If anyone ever wants to sit down and talk about Marauders or Hellions, I'm in. X-Men Children of the Atom is a fantastic Capcom-made fighting game from the early 90s that's held up. It doesn't quite hit the highs of, say, X-Men vs. Street Fighter, as that's one of the greatest of all time in conversation, but we wouldn't have the entire Marvel vs. Capcom series if it wasn't for this very good 2D fighter. This originally came out for the arcades as well as the Sega Saturn in the mid-90s, with a pretty dang good port that's actually affordable. However, I guess the decision was made to also bring it to the PlayStation 1 in 1998, and instead of letting Capcom handle it, Acclaim published it with Probe Entertainment in charge of the port, leading to easily the worst version of a very, very good game. I hope you like loading screens all the time. The PlayStation 1 version of Children of the Atom is filled with all kinds of slowdowns. Some of the animation frames were removed to make it work, and it's bizarre to me that they failed to make a game from 1994 run well, especially when Capcom pushed out MVC1 a year later. Granted, that was also the worst version of Marvel vs. Capcom, so I guess these early 2D fighters were just a little too fast-paced and beefy for the 32-bit behemoth. Nonetheless, even if you're notoriously the worst version of a game, that PlayStation 1 collector bonus will have you going for well over $100 complete in box. Same story with MVC 1 and 2, all fantastic fighters going for a pretty penny no matter the platform. But hey, quick reminder that the Dreamcast cover, the second one, features Psylocke and Guile, no one else, and that's pretty awesome. This era of Capcom fighters was and still is my favorite. X-Men Children of the Atom is a pretty freaking cool game that everyone should play despite those prices, but it's not like the good version of the game is attainable by normal means anyway, so thanks Fightcade. While we're at it, let's talk about a couple other really cool games that also aren't cheap. I'm sure anyone familiar with retro video game prices is very well aware of the TurboGrafx 16. When the cheapest game on the console is still in the double digits, you know you've got yourself a pricey collection. Granted, that's got nothing on Magical Chase. Developed by Quest, the people behind Tactics Ogre, my favorite, Magical Chase is a fast-paced side-scrolling shmup. Yeah, turns out a lot of these have high values in the States. You just might not be expecting $8,000 complete. According to eBay listings, these ones aren't moving too frequently, which makes sense considering the sheer numbers we're looking at. Despite all that, Magical Chase is actually a pretty fun time. It follows in the same footsteps as Gradius in the Cotton series, where you play as a magical witch girl shooting oodles and oodles of everything. There's little stops that you make along the way to buy upgrades and power-ups as opposed to picking them up, and the directional lock-on system provides a good bit of challenge. There are much better shmups before and after this, so Magical Chase isn't like some legendary game of yesterday, but it is a pretty cool experience. However, if we're equating dollar value to game length, considering you can beat this in half an hour, you're looking at $16,000 an hour. That sounds reasonable, huh? The TurboGrafx 16 is home to a lot of unique experiences, kind of like the 3DO, except a higher standard of quality across the board. If you owned a PC Engine, TurboGrafx, or were just sentient in the early 90s, you probably heard about Bonk. Sega had Sonic, Nintendo had Mario, NEC Home Electronics had Bonk. A caveman, one who uses his head to, well, bonk things to death. Mario used his rippers, Bonk would bonk. For some reason, he didn't really catch on, though if you wanted to play some Bonk, you had a ton of options. He wasn't even TurboGrafx exclusive. Bonk's adventure made its way onto the NES, Game Boy, Super Nintendo, and even the GameCube. If you want to own a single game in this franchise, though, be prepared to shell out a boatload of money for any of them. Seriously, I think the only franchise that rivals the average price wall might be Pokemon. So, Bonk 3, Bonk's Big Adventure. That's right, we got Bonk twice in the title. This thing hit the TurboGrafx 16 and the CD attachment they released and resells for upwards of $1,200 boxed. It's also pretty good. The whole series has a 7 to 8 out of 10 level of quality, and having one of these on the CD just allows the fun music to sing even louder. The game has a bit of a slower pace, but the process of using your noggin to literally crush everything in sight is fun. Any game that'll let me climb walls with my teeth is great. How's about Ribbit King? Frolf. This is what happens when you combine golfing with living animals. Hit the frog, watch the frog go. Try to rack up as many points as possible and get yourself in the hole. This used to be an affordable game and technically still is on the PlayStation 2, but once again that GameCube tax struck it hard, making a loose copy a little expensive. This is a great one to play with friends who also like obnoxious cute things, or hitting cute things with big hammers. Yay, violence! And now for our last game of the day, and something that's easily the pure opposite of Ribbit King, something that's held up in quality over the years as well as price. I kind of forgot to mention it in my Celebrity of Games video, but it is worth talking about. Def Jam Fight for New York.
A fight. Winner takes all.
And the loser.
The loser? Hell, I don't know. Loser goes to Jersey.
Oh yeah, it's time. Def Jam Fight for New York is an awesome game. At the time, I didn't really get it because all I knew was World of Warcraft, but now as a grown man, I can boot this up and I get it. Def Jam Fight for New York is the sequel to Vendetta, a well-received fighting game that combined hip-hop and celebrities into a ridiculous experience. Technically, more on the wrestling side because it was developed by Aki Corp, responsible for WWF, No Mercy, and all the other best wrestling games back in the day. Fight for New York is absolutely the perfected version of this. It's faster, more brutal, has way more characters, a longer campaign, more all of the things. It's also a little less wrestling and more of a brawler. You've got multiple fighting styles you can pick from, all of which play differently. Although no matter what, the goal of each battle is the same: knock out your opponent. The environments are a big part of each battle, and when you get into the free-for-all action, it gets a little nutty. Fill up that momentum meter, get a ridiculous zoom in on your face, and do some over-the-top attacks. If you've ever played a fighting game, you know how this works. Fight for New York is just a really solid one of those. It just also happens to have a full-length campaign featuring the likes of Method Man, Henry Rollins, Carmen Electra, Body Count Ice-T, and of course, Snoop Dogg, and so many more. I think part of the charm is that it takes itself 100% seriously. You get to customize your own character to fight with in a system that puts together a little art piece for you to make before being shown a model that looks kind of correct. I tried to make me, but it didn't really work. Plus, I'm not this buff. I don't think I'll ever be. It's hilarious watching your dude in cutscenes, though.
Well, if it ain't America's Most Wanted, that police composite don't do justice to your ugly face. Shut your mouth.
The gameplay feels great. It falls somewhere between strategic and chaotic, as you're attempting to pull off these over-the-top moves on dudes large enough to make an official Meat Madness match. There's not a moment I'm playing Fight for New York where I'm bored or not enjoying myself, and the plethora of unlockables means I'll be there even longer. And I guess a lot of people felt that way too, because this thing has steadily gone up in price to where a boxed copy is getting close to $200 on the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and nearly $100 on the Xbox here in the States. That's crazy, but I'd assume there's a ton of nostalgia over here for this. It's got a fantastic, memorable soundtrack, tons of personality, a well-made campaign, a ridiculous amount of stuff to unlock, and endless hours of multiplayer fun to be had. It's unfortunate that the sequel, Def Jam Icon, failed to live up to that. It really sucks to say that something like Def Jam Fight for New York is now probably something you'll never own unless you already did, because it did sell well. It had a greatest hits release, but that kind of quality and demand makes it a hot commodity that I don't think people are really wanting to get rid of. I will say, if you've never played this story, grab a few friends and have yourself a campaign playthrough. It's absurd, and like watching an All the Warriors anime moment, just with Ludacris instead of Goku.
Get out the way.
So there you have it. Even more rare and expensive video games that you'll probably never own unless you already did, in which case I'm just saying things. I feel pretty lucky to have held on to my copies of games like Suikoden or X-Men Children of the Atom for all these years. These things just keep raising up in prices. I mean, I hate that they're worth so much that it prevents normal people from playing old school games, but I'll definitely do my best to take care of something like this. Unless there's disc rot, in which case I'm screwed. What's the most rare and expensive game that you own? I know someone in the comments is gonna be like, I got 4 copies of Pokemon Box, and like, you know, share the wealth, homie. You can put down a payment on a car with that thing. If you like the video, give me a thumbs up, check out the sponsor, or if you want to support me directly, head on over to my Patreon or buy a t-shirt over at the Pixel Empire. I put everything y'all provide back into the channel, and I hope that every single one of y'all is enjoying what you see. And for now, I'm gonna head back to the 100%.
David Paulides' missing 411 theory has raised the awareness of some strange missing person cases and unusual incidents in the wilderness and forests around the world. The family and friends of the people in these cases deserve answers to the unsolved mysteries, to find out what really happened, and in some cases, to lay their loved ones to rest. Number 10. The disappearance of Kevin O'Keefe from Glacier Bay National Park left park rangers confused and unsettled. Decades later, his case has never been solved, and little more is known about his whereabouts than how he was discovered missing. Like many of the cases that can be classed under the missing 411 phenomenon, Kevin was described as an experienced outdoor enthusiast. He was from Sacramento, California, and had plenty of experience camping and hiking. In 1985, he planned a trip to Alaska to spend a few weeks out in the wilderness. This would obviously be very different to his experiences in California, and Kevin took the time to prepare for this specifically. He took survival classes to prepare for the Alaskan wilderness, and carefully planned his trip. Kevin arrived at Glacier Bay on September 20th and went to the park headquarters to introduce himself. He told the park rangers where he would be staying and for how long. His plan was to leave on October 10th, and he had a pickup scheduled. The rangers didn't see any problems with Kevin's plans, and he headed out to an area called Wolf Point, a campsite near the Muir Inlet. The area is mostly covered in dense forest, with thin stretches of beach surrounding the water. For weeks, nobody heard from Kevin. This wasn't surprising, as this was part of his planned experience. On October 8th, a few days before he was due to leave, park rangers were on patrol when they passed near his designated camping location and decided to check in on it. The first thing they found was that Kevin's camp had been made much closer to the water's edge than was planned. The high tide mark came almost up to his tent, but that alone wasn't what was wrong. Kevin's belongings were scattered around as if someone had been going through them. The tent was still zipped up, with Kevin's sleeping bag and pack inside, but one of the poles had been broken. Rangers found food stashes around the camp and a backpack that looked like it had been prepared for a hike. It was an odd scene, but the rangers assumed that Kevin was out on a day hike. The state of his camp could be explained as him preparing to pack up to leave in a few days. The following morning, the Rangers returned to the camp and found everything was exactly how it had been the day before. Nothing had been touched. There wasn't even any sign that animals had come in to investigate the food that had been left behind. Kevin hadn't been planning any overnight hikes, so the fact he hadn't returned was extremely worrying. A search of the camp showed he'd left behind belongings that he would have taken on a hike. In fact, it looked as if he'd been preparing to go out when something had happened. Air and ground searches took place, with 3 sniffer dogs being brought in to try to find Kevin. There was no sign of him in the surrounding areas, but dogs led investigators to 3 items about a half-mile away. Hidden in a gully that couldn't be seen from the camp was a pair of boots, a hat, and a glove liner that belonged to Kevin. No other trace of him was found. Investigators were at a loss as to what might have happened to him. There was no sign of an animal attack at the campsite. In fact, what even made the disappearance especially eerie was the fact that animals had left the camp alone. Even after it had been abandoned, nothing came to take any of the food. There was also no sign of an animal attack at the location where Kevin's shoes and hat were found. It's possible that Kevin had, for some reason, gotten into trouble in the water. It was never explained why he had camped so close to the water's edge, as he would have presumably known the dangers of this. But if he'd ended up in the water, that didn't explain how his belongings ended up in the gully, or why nothing else was ever found. His disappearance remains a mystery. Kevin is listed on NamUs as being 5 foot 10 inches tall and weighing 120 pounds. If alive today, he would be 74 years old. Number 9. Oregon's Mount Hood is a popular hiking and climbing destination, with thousands of people visiting every year. Sadly, it can also be Browns was one of them. Fred was a 49-year-old sign painter originally from California, who'd recently moved to Portland with his family. His wife described him as extremely physically fit. He was an experienced hiker and had completed multiple marathons. He'd also visited Mount Hood 4 times previously and had gone on lone hikes to a spot called the Hogback at an elevation of 10,500 feet. He was last seen on March 2nd, 2003. Fred, his wife, and their 2 sons had arrived at Timberland Lodge that morning. Fred decided to take a solo trip to Hogback, telling his wife that he would be back by 5 p.m. If he wasn't back by then, she was to assume something had gone wrong. Fred took with him snowshoes, a water bottle, and some apples. When Fred set off, the weather conditions were perfect for climbing. It was cold but clear, and had been for a while. Even though Fred wasn't used to mountaineering, his family believed he was capable of handling those conditions. Unfortunately, the pleasant weather rapidly deteriorated. By noon, there was fog on the mountain. A snowstorm came in by 1 p.m., and it would have been impossible for Fred or any other climbers to see where they were going. Fred didn't return to the lodge. His wife raised the alarm at 6 p.m., and the search for Fred began. The weather conditions made searching for anybody on the mountain extremely difficult. The search and rescue teams had access to helicopters, but they could only be used for brief periods at a time, as the fog and cloud cover made flying on the mountain too dangerous. The conditions didn't stop over 50 people from searching the mountain on foot, though. A large area of the mountain was searched, down from the summit to an area called a Triangle Moraine, making sure they covered all the areas where Fred might have reached. It was assumed that he'd gotten lost during the whiteout conditions, and there was a special focus on a place called Zigzag Canyon. It would have been natural for Fred to have made his way here, following the mountain's fall line. After several days, the search had to be called off. Despite the below-freezing conditions, Fred's wife still hoped that he might be alive, sheltering in a cave somewhere and waiting for rescue. But it was too dangerous to send teams onto the mountain. Months later, in August of that year, another search team was sent up to the mountain. The mission was a training exercise, but they'd hoped to find Fred's body. They discovered human remains in Zigzag Canyon, wearing clothes that were similar to those Fred was last seen wearing. But when the remains were recovered, it was confirmed they didn't belong to the missing man. The remains puzzled authorities. At that point, there were only 3 people known to have gone missing on the mountain, and Fred was the only one to have disappeared on its south side. The remains have not been identified. Despite countless people climbing the area where Fred disappeared, he remains missing to this day. Fred was last seen wearing a red jacket and snowshoes. He didn't carry a phone or a mountain rescue unit. Anyone with information in this case should contact the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office at 503-655-8218. Number 8. In September of 2013, Roger Bainbridge traveled from his home in England to Greece to visit his sister. He'd been making the trip every summer for 8 years, but this time he would never return. Ever since, his family have been searching for answers that have never emerged. Roger was 67 years old at the time of his disappearance. His missing person case is one of many similar stories of older British men disappearing while on Greek islands. Some of these people were found, but many like Roger remain a mystery. Roger's sister, Maggie, had a holiday home on the Greek island of Paxos. He'd been there several times before, and his trip in the late summer of 2013 seemed to be no different. He was having a good time when, on September 26th, he decided to take a day trip to the neighboring island of Antipaxos. Roger told his sister that he would be back by 7 p.m. when they planned to have a barbecue together. The last confirmed sighting of Roger was as he left the ferry on the small island of Antipaxos. Antipaxos is located just a 15-minute ferry ride from neighboring Paxos. It's an area of only 2 square miles and only around 20 permanent residents. It has several beaches, but inland is covered in dense vegetation and vineyards, with many walking paths. It was along one of those paths that Roger likely disappeared. Roger was described as an experienced walker, and his family didn't believe a day's walking around the small island should have been any problem for him. He was wearing walking shoes and carrying a bottle of water. When Roger didn't return to his sister's home that evening, he was reported missing. Trying to investigate the disappearance of a loved one while they're away from home is always difficult. The Bainbridge family faced added difficulties due to just how few people lived on the Paxos and Antipaxos islands. Only 2 police officers were able to cover the missing person investigation, but the expat community in the area helped to search the area on foot. Early in the investigation, some fellow walkers came forward to say that they'd seen Roger along one of the trails. Nothing out of the ordinary was reported about this sighting, and there were apparently no signs that he was about to vanish into thin air. Even though the island was small, the vegetation made it difficult to search. But even with this, it was possible to conduct an extensive search. A helicopter with thermal imaging equipment was used to try to see through the brush. His family believed he might have fallen or gotten lost somewhere and was just waiting to be found. But as the days of searching wore on, it seemed less and less likely. There was also the possibility that he'd somehow ended up in the water. Roger was a strong swimmer, but it's possible for anybody to get into trouble in open water. Snorkelers searched the area directly surrounding the island but found no trace of Roger. Experts claimed that if he'd passed away in the ocean, his body would have washed ashore within a few weeks, but that didn't happen. Another hope was that Roger had somehow made it off the island, but had possibly suffered from some kind of mental health crisis that caused him to forget who he was. He didn't have his passport and only had 50 euros with him when he disappeared, so he likely wouldn't have gotten far. No evidence for any of the theories has been uncovered. More than 10 years on, Roger remains missing, with no new clues to explain what happened to him. Number 7. One of the cases David Paulides highlighted in his Missing 411 books is that of Richard R. Lee. Richard's disappearance without a trace was in 2004, and almost 20 years later, there's been no new news about his disappearance. Richard was 47 years old at the time of his disappearance. He had experienced hiking in the wilderness, and his friends and family knew he didn't like to stick to the beaten path. He would go to explore areas that might be hard to reach, and camp in places that weren't designated as campgrounds. Even with these risky behaviors, nobody expected that he wouldn't come back out from the wilderness. On September 9, 2004, he left his home in Washington and traveled to Wenatchee Okanagan National Forest. The park sits on the eastern slopes of the Cascade Mountain Range and is known for its stunning scenery. Richard intended to spend 2 days camping there before returning home on September 11th. He filled out the permit to go camping, filed it at the office, and then set off for the Kolchak Lake region of the park. According to Paulides, this part of the Cascade Mountains is something of a hotspot for missing person cases. with many people who disappear here never being found. At some point during his stay, Richard contacted his brother via cell phone for a chat. He told his brother he was fine and that he was on a ridge line. The conversation seemed normal, but it was the last time anybody would hear from Richard. Richard's wife wasn't immediately worried when he didn't return home as planned. She assumed he just decided to stay longer and thought he would make his way home eventually. But by September 15th, she was worried enough to contact authorities. The search began the same day. Richard's vehicle was located at a trailhead in the park, which helped investigators to narrow down the region where he might have been. A 70 square mile search area was set up, which encompassed Lake Stewart, Kolchak Lake, and Enchantment Lakes. Investigators knew it was going to be difficult to track Richard, as he had a habit of camping off the trail. A lot of the investigation was spent hiking cross-country to try to locate any trace of it. To make matters worse, 8 inches of snow had fallen since Richard had disappeared, covering any tracks he might have made. Eventually, Richard's campsite was found, 500 feet off a trail near Kolchak Lake. His sleeping bag and food had been placed in a tree to try to keep it away from bears, but other than that, it looked as if Richard had just left. It was as if he might return at any moment, but there was no sign of him in the surrounding area. According to Politis, the searchers who found Richard's campsite got an uneasy feeling about it. There was nothing specific that they could say was wrong, but it was an unnerving location. Searches continued in the following days, but without any clues about where Richard might have gone, there was a lot of ground to cover. In the days before his disappearance, the weather had been clear with no snow. That meant that Richard likely wasn't dressed for the weather conditions he was lost in, making it even less likely he had survived. Eventually, the search had to be called off, with no explanation for where Richard might have gone. The area where he disappeared is particularly rugged, and it would be easy for someone to fall or become stuck. But strangely, no trace of Richard or any of his clothes has ever been uncovered in the decades since he vanished. Number 6. Many cases covered by the Missing 411 phenomenon involve those with hiking experience in the outdoors. This might make it seem more mysterious, but it could also just be that this type of person is more likely to underestimate the challenges that lead to their disappearance. This may have been the case for Yi Jianhua, who went missing in Glacier National Park in August of 2008. Hua arrived at the park's St. Mary Visitor Center on August 11th with an extensive itinerary of what he was going to do in the coming days. He had plenty of previous hiking experience and wrote about his experience with various pieces of equipment for a website dedicated to hiking gear. His trip to the Glacier National Park would be his most challenging hike yet. It was supposed to be a trip he was taking with his wife, but she'd been forced to drop out due to a family incident. Rather than postponing the trip, Hua decided to take it as a solo hiker. The rangers at St. Mary were reluctant to issue Hua the permit for his hike. Even the first day was something even experienced hikers would find difficult, and it wasn't something they recommended someone do solo. But Hua was able to persuade them to give him a permit to go into the backcountry. He left them with a complete list of where he was planning to stay and when, as well as the equipment that he had with him. The first day of his trip was supposed to take him through Flora Park and onto Sperry Campground. It was a steep and challenging climb that would take him past crevices, loose scree, and fast-flowing streams. There would be 7 more days of hiking before he arrived at Kintla Lake Camp, where he told his family he would call them. When that call didn't come, his family contacted rangers to report him as missing. Park rangers were able to narrow down the time of Hua's disappearance to the first day of his hike. They located his car, fully packed with things he had intended to collect after his first night in the park. But the biggest clue was the fact that none of the campers at Sperry Campground remembered seeing a solo hiker. An extensive search of the region where Hua went missing took place. A search team with technical rope training descended into crevices into the glacier where Hua had been hiking, while helicopters, canine teams, and horseback riders searched the surface. A total of 2,500 man-hours was spent looking for the missing person, and a search so thorough that park rangers began to wonder whether he was actually in the park at all. It was possible he'd gotten a ride from someone and headed elsewhere, though there was no reason why he might have wanted to do that. Years later, in July of 2011, hikers climbing up a dry creek bed near Avalanche Lake spotted something unusual. In the weeds were a nylon strap and items of clothing. He contacted park officials, who then discovered bone fragments. These were confirmed as belonging to Hua. It's believed they were transported to this location by water and avalanches, and he'd passed away further upstream. What happened to Hua and how exactly he was missed, despite the extensive search, remains a mystery. Number 5. The disappearance of Ren Tieshe is a confusing missing person case from China that has left investigators perplexed since he vanished in 2008. Ren was a retired geography teacher who lived and grew up in Beijing. According to his family, his dream was to climb all the famous mountains in Beijing, but Mount Miaofeng was one that he was very familiar with. He'd climbed the mountain many times before and knew the mountain well. Ren's wife thought his trip on September 30th would be no different to any of the other trips. He told her he was going on a hike with 2 friends, but they changed plans at the last moment. Ren decided to continue anyway. He took with him a blue backpack filled with food, water, 2 newspapers, and some scraps of paper. He planned to be home that same afternoon, as it was his mother's birthday, the following day, and he needed to be well rested for that. When Ren wasn't home by 5 p.m., his wife started to try to contact him. She hadn't heard from him since that morning, which was unusual. Normally, he would send her photos and updates while he was hiking, but this time there had just been silence. Ren didn't answer the phone. Either that evening or the following afternoon, he was reported missing. Investigations uncovered some strange sightings and contact with Ren on the day of his disappearance. He was spotted that morning at the base of the mountain by a local, who noted that it was odd that not many people were around that day. During the afternoon, one of Ren's friends called him and invited him to play cards with him. They talked for about 15 minutes, and he explained that he was on his way down the mountain, so he couldn't come. At this point, what happened to Ren becomes unclear. Witnesses and phone records took the investigators in one direction, while some disturbing finds on the mountain seemed to indicate something else had happened. A witness who had encountered Ren on the day of his disappearance said they pointed him in the direction of Wangping. This was after he'd asked about the best place to get some nuts. Witnesses in Wangping said that he asked about how to get to Tuofeng, another town. Ren's phone record picked up again in the village of Zhenfeng, a remote area that would be easy to get lost in. Zhenfeng is in the complete opposite direction of Tuofeng, and how he ended up there is unclear, but witnesses in the village did claim to have seen him. Meanwhile, search and rescue teams on the mountain itself came across a strange sight. Someone had torn strips from a newspaper and tied them to trees, apparently creating a trail. It was the same issue of the newspaper that Ren was known to have had with him at the time. Investigators later found what looked like a campsite and a note, apparently left by Ren. He described himself and said that he'd gotten lost while hiking down to the Tiaotuo mountain on September 30th. He'd stayed on the mountain for one night, then began to follow the mountain ridge northeast, headed towards the Shishdao village. Ren's wife said the note was in her husband's handwriting. A final twist came on October 7th, when Ren's phone was activated again at a Beijing West Central station. It seemed likely that Ren was no longer in possession of his phone, but when exactly the new owner got a hold of it is unclear. Despite numerous searches of the area where Ren vanished, no trace of him has ever been found. Number 4. Sadly, many missing person cases never get the level of attention that makes the disappearance well known. After initial investigations come to an end, the missing person case fades from the public eye, while the family and friends of the individual continue to live with unanswered questions. The disappearance of Stephen Litzy is one case that didn't receive much attention. Over 10 years on from when he first vanished, little is known about what happened to him, and few details have been made public. Stephen was 71 years old at the time of his disappearance. He moved to Paradise, California in the 1980s, and was at home in the outdoors. According to his sister, he described the wilderness where he would go hunting as his church, and he loved spending time there. On the morning of October 29, 2011, Stephen and a deer hunting partner traveled to Diamond Lake, Oregon, about 125 miles north of the California border. They traveled to the Twin Lakes area and split up at around 7:30 a.m. The plan was to meet again that afternoon, though a specific time has never been mentioned in the press. Stephen didn't arrive at the designated meeting spot. The following day, when there was still no sign or word from Stephen, his hunting partner reported him missing. Stephen had left his cell phone and GPS device in his hamper, and there was little for investigators to go on to try to find him. There hadn't been any other missing person cases in this specific area, so investigators didn't have past data to try to figure out where he may have gone. Making matters worse, Stephen was wearing camouflage gear to help with hunting. It would be very difficult to spot him from a distance. For 4 days, searchers went through the wilderness where Stephen was last seen. A few candy wrappers and water bottles were found, but it wasn't possible to say whether these had been left by Stephen. After 4 days, snow forced search teams to stop their search. There was still nothing that could narrow down an area where Stephen might have traveled through, and no way of knowing what happened to him. It's possible he simply had a medical emergency while alone in the woods and hasn't yet been found. The many waterways in the area could have also hidden his fate. Fires in the area in recent years would only make it harder to answer these questions. Neither Stephen nor his hunting weapon has ever been found. Stephen is described as being 5 foot 6 inches tall and weighing 130 pounds. Anybody with information on this case should contact the Douglas County Sheriff's Office at 541-440-4293. Number 3. Ben Nevis in the Scottish Highlands is Britain's tallest mountain at 4,413 feet. Every year it attracts thousands of climbers, most of whom make it to the top without a problem. But every year there are a few that run into trouble on the slopes of the mountain. Low clouds and tricky weather conditions can make it easy for someone to get lost and turned around. While it isn't the most difficult climb, it's easy to underestimate the hike, leading to mountain rescue being called. It's hard to know just how prepared Harvey Christian was for the challenge when he set off to climb Ben Nevis on January 27, 2023. Harvey was 42 years old and from Cambridgeshire. He traveled to Scotland, specifically to climb Ben Nevis, and was hiking alone. There were few details available about how he planned for the hike, and it's not even known what exactly he was wearing when he vanished without a trace. The police have stated he was likely wearing waterproofs and walking boots. It was a few days after Harvey vanished that he was reported missing. His vehicle, a black Vauxhall Crossland X, was located in Glen Nevis and looked as if it had been untouched for a few days. Investigators believed Harvey started his hike up Ben Nevis from the Glen Nevis Visitor Center at around 10:30 a.m. He would have taken the typical route up the mountain from there, a hike that would have taken somewhere between 6 and 9 hours. January isn't the most popular month for hikes in the Scottish Highlands, but it's unlikely that Harvey would have been alone on the mountain, and the police appealed for anybody who might have spotted him to come forward. A few days after news of Harvey's disappearance broke, hikers reported seeing him on a section of the mountain referred to as the Zigzags. The route is part of the typical tourist path, which crisscrosses the western side of Ben Nevis on the start of the approach to the summit. Unfortunately, the exact time of the sighting is unclear, and it's not known if the hikers saw Harvey when he was on his way up, or if he'd been returning from the peak. Whichever is the case, Harvey clearly didn't make it back to his car, and investigators were confident he was still on the mountain. Search and rescue teams worked with dogs to search the mountain. Helicopters and drones were also utilized so that gullies and dangerous-to-reach areas could be found. Even if the hike is relatively simple, it can still be dangerous, especially if Harvey had decided to venture off the typical path for whatever reason. Despite these early leads in the investigation, no new information was found. In the months following Harvey's disappearance, there were many other instances of people getting lost or into trouble on Ben Nevis, and the mountain rescue teams were called out multiple times. In March, the body of a missing hiker was located, but it did not belong to Harvey. Police continue to appeal for information for anybody who might have seen anything unusual while climbing the mountain. So far, there have been no new leads that have brought a close to this mystery. It's believed Harvey is still on the mountain, possibly buried beneath a snowdrift. Harvey is described as being 6 foot 2 inches tall with a heavy build and fair hair. Anybody with information on this case can contact the police on 101, quoting incident 3318 on January 28, 2023. Number 2. It isn't very often that someone becomes a missing person while out on a bike ride. Normally, these cases are resolved relatively quickly, but the case of Marty Letcher stands out as one that's gone unanswered for over a decade. Marty was 30 years old at the time of his disappearance. He was an avid biker who'd recently gotten a new Santa Cruz Heckler bike. May 29, 2014 was his third time taking the bike out. He told his family he would be back at 4 p.m. and set off with the bike in his car to go to some nearby trails. The Spider Lake trails were roughly a 20-minute drive from Marty's home in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He'd been to the trails once before and had brought a map with him on this occasion, but he left it in his car. It seemed like he was confident in the route he was going to take. The biking trails are described as being not particularly remote. The trailhead is located in a residential area, and the location is bordered on one side by a highway, but it quickly devolves into a rugged terrain with thick brush and woods with steep drops. The trails themselves are single track, where it would be impossible for two cyclists to ride side by side, and they're bumpy. When Marty didn't return home at 4 p.m., his family went out to search for him. They then called the police later that day to report him as a missing person. The search for Marty became one of the biggest that search and rescue teams in the area had ever conducted. More than 450 people were involved in the search for Marty, which included helicopters, dogs, and boats. Part of the search team was made up of Canadian military members who combed through the wooded area for any sign of Marty or his bike. Marty's family believed that if they found his bike, they would find him. They didn't think Marty would have abandoned it, given it was so new. It would also have allowed him to cover more ground if he was lost and trying to get back to civilization. Unfortunately, that meant that the search area was much larger than it would have been if Marty was on foot. The search area covered almost 60 square miles, but it's possible that Marty may have gotten outside that area before the search party even began. After a week of searching through the dense woods, the official search for Marty was called off. There are a few different theories about what might have happened to Marty. If he'd gone off trail for whatever reason, it would have been easy for him to become wounded in some way and unable to continue. Multiple members of the search team suffered falls, and even though nobody was seriously hurt, an accident could have been serious if they were alone. The search team also scaled a 9-meter cliff at one point. Marty wasn't found there, but there may have been other areas where he could have fallen. A few years after he disappeared, a body was discovered within the search area. Medical examiners determined it wasn't Marty, but another individual who had gone missing 7 months before Marty's disappearance. The discovery showed that it was possible that someone might have been missed within the search area, and Marty and his bike could still be out there, waiting to be found. Another possibility is that he was struck by a vehicle. At some points, the trail leads to a